Have you ever stopped to think that your own thoughts might be a way for God to communicate with you? What if I told you that the answer to that dilemma you've been carrying is already there, in your mind, just waiting to be discovered? Wouldn't it be crazy to believe that the answers to our biggest challenges can appear in the most unexpected ways, without grand signs or visions? The truth is, God can speak to us in ways we never imagined, and most of the time, He does so through our own thoughts. Now, imagine this. You're going through an ordinary day, dealing with everyday issues, family problems, work pressures, maybe an important decision to make. Life is simply happening. But then, in the midst of it all, something changes. Suddenly, a thought emerges, like a light illuminating that doubt that has been consuming you. A spark, an idea that comes from within, something that makes perfect sense, yet at the same time, you're not quite sure where it came from. Could this be just a coincidence? Or could it be God's way of guiding you, speaking to you when you least expect it? How is that possible? Through a simple thought? What if I told you that this is often how He works? The answer you're looking for might be right there, hidden within your own thoughts, just waiting to be recognized. Has this ever happened to you? Maybe you've had an experience where something in your mind suddenly made you see a situation in a completely different way. And perhaps in the midst of all the confusion, you didn't realize that it was actually God trying to show you something, guiding you. Sometimes He doesn't need to make noise to be heard. Sometimes He whispers through an idea that suddenly appears. But how can we know if that thought is really God's voice or just a passing idea? How can we distinguish what comes from God from what comes from our own mind or external influences? Now let's look at a clear example of how God used someone's thoughts to transform their life and guide them to something greater. Then you'll understand how this process works in practice. Let's dive in. Let's go back in time and look at the story of Samuel, a young man who, in a simple and seemingly ordinary moment, experienced something that would change his life forever. Samuel was lying in his place, sleeping, when something happened. Voice, clear and distinct, called his name. "Samuel!" It echoed, breaking the silence of the night. But here's the curious detail. At first, Samuel didn't recognize that the voice was from God. He got up, confused, and went to the priest, Eli, thinking Eli had called him. This happened 3 times. He was hearing, but he didn't understand. His thoughts were filled with doubts and uncertainties. What seemed like a simple call in the middle of the night was, in fact, divine communication, one he didn't yet know how to interpret. The Bible tells us that after the 3rd time, Eli realized what was happening and told Samuel, "If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" 1 Samuel 3:9. That was when Samuel understood that this voice was not just any voice. It was God's voice. But before reaching that understanding, Samuel had to go through a process of doubt, reflection, and most importantly, realizing that God's communication often comes in subtle and simple ways. And have you ever had a moment like that, when something appeared in your mind, and for a second you thought it was just another random thought? But upon deeper reflection, you realized there was something more profound there, something that touched your heart in an unexpected way. Sometimes the thoughts that arise in our minds are not just passing ideas. They may be God's voice trying to guide us. And just like Samuel, it might take us some time to recognize it. What do we learn from Samuel? God doesn't always speak in supernatural or dramatic ways, as many might expect. Sometimes He speaks to us through our own thoughts. What initially seemed like an ordinary thought, if observed more carefully, could actually be God's answer. Samuel took time to understand, but he learned to recognize God's voice. And we, like him, can learn to perceive these divine messages. Now, let's go even deeper. Have you ever considered that your thoughts might be signs guiding you towards something greater? Sometimes, the answers we seek are much closer than we imagine and may appear in ways we don't immediately recognize. Let's explore this further with another biblical example that teaches us how to distinguish God's signs. Now let's look at the story of Elijah, a man who went through moments of extreme hardship, fear, and doubt. Elijah had been persecuted for his faith and was facing a storm of troubling thoughts. At one point, he hid in a cave, seeking refuge, trying to understand what God had to say about all the chaos in his life. He needed clear direction, a sign to guide him, but what happened next was something Elijah did not expect. God said to him, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." 1 Kings 19:11. So Elijah stepped out and stood before God, but what he experienced was surprising. First came a mighty wind that tore through rocks and trees, then an earthquake, and finally, a fire. But God's voice was in none of these things. The Bible tells us that God was not in the wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the fire. And after all of this, a gentle whisper, 1 Kings 19:12. It was in the silence, in the softness of something that seemed insignificant, that God spoke directly to Elijah. A voice that does not shout, but brings peace, clarity, and direction. Have you ever noticed that in times of pain or turmoil, God does not shout at you, but instead communicates subtly through a quiet thought? How would you react if, in the middle of the storm, that silent peace arose in your heart? What if, among all the noise of your life, the real answer was in the calmness of your mind, just waiting to be heard? Many times we are so accustomed to the loudness of the world, its chaos, rush, and fears, that we forget that God's voice, in contrast, comes gently, like a clear thought in the midst of confusion. God's true direction is often not found in the noise, but in the silence. It is essential to distinguish when we are hearing our own voice and when we are hearing God's voice. Our minds can be filled with ideas and thoughts, but when God speaks, there is something different, a deep peace, a clarity that does not come from our own reasoning or logic, but one that brings tranquility and guidance. Peace and clarity are unmistakable marks of his communication. Now imagine that even in such a subtle way, God may be speaking to you at the exact moment you need it most. And this brings us to a crucial point. What should we do when that voice appears? How should we respond to this divine guidance, which often comes in unexpected and quiet ways? Let's explore this in the next example and understand how we can act when God's voice calls us. Now let's look at the story of Moses. Do you remember Moses? He was living a quiet life, shepherding sheep in the desert, when something extraordinary happened. God called him, but not in the way he expected. In the middle of the desert, before a burning bush, Moses heard the voice of God saying, "I have seen the affliction of my people in Egypt, and I am sending you to set them free." At that moment, Moses had a thought, a clear intuition that he should return to Egypt to fulfill that calling. But what did he do with that thought? He doubted, he was afraid, he felt unqualified, and he began to question why he, of all people, was chosen. God, in his patience, guided Moses step by step, giving him signs and showing him that he was not alone. But still, Moses was afraid. He hesitated, even tried to run away, asking God to choose someone else. But in the end, he surrendered to that thought, that calling that had arisen in his mind. He obeyed, even with fear, and went to Egypt to free his people, fulfilling the mission God had given him. What started as a simple thought turned into a powerful action that changed the destiny of a nation. What if God is speaking to you right now? Maybe not in a grand way, like a burning bush, but through a simple thought, a clear idea that emerges in your mind. What if that idea is the answer to something you are going through, perhaps even an important mission for your life? What would you do with that message? Would you feel the urgency to act, or would you hesitate, full of doubts like Moses? Sometimes what God says does not come with great signs or miracles, but as a quiet thought, a gentle direction. And often, our initial response is resistance. Sometimes when God speaks to us, our first reaction is resistance. Doubt and fear make us hesitate, afraid to take the next step. But like Moses, we can learn that true obedience is not the absence of fear, but trusting in the calling despite it. And when we obey, despite our doubts, we find unexpected freedom, a peace that comes from following divine direction, even when we do not fully understand it. Obeying God's calling, even with a heart full of uncertainties, brings liberation, clarity, and above all, peace. And speaking of obedience, when God's voice manifests in our thoughts, it often challenges us to act. This challenge, which comes as a small impulse or a seemingly simple idea, can change our entire trajectory. What happens then when we choose to follow what God has told us? Let's explore this further and understand the impact of hearing and following divine direction. Let's look at a powerful example from the life of Paul. He was a determined man with a clear path in mind, but that path was completely opposed to the followers of Jesus. He persecuted Christians, believing he was doing the right thing. But everything changed when, on a journey to Damascus, something extraordinary happened. A light shone from heaven, and he fell to the ground, blinded, not knowing what was happening. There, in the midst of darkness, something surprising occurred. God spoke to him directly through a thought that Paul had never imagined before. During that time of physical blindness, he had the opportunity to reflect on his life, his actions, and the purpose God had for him. It was in that silence, in that darkness, that true transformation took place. He was healed, his eyes were opened, but more than that, he received a revelation that changed his life forever. That simple thought, that divine direction in his mind, led him to follow a new path. Instead of persecuting Christians, he became one of the greatest defenders of the Christian faith, spreading the gospel throughout the world. Paul's life was radically transformed, and it all started with a thought he chose to follow, a thought given by God. The impact of that decision not only altered Paul's destiny, but also shaped the future of the Christian church. Now, take a moment to reflect. Can you see how a single thought can change your entire life? How many times have you had an idea, an inspiration, an intuition, and by following it, everything around you changed? Sometimes, the direction that seems small, almost insignificant, is actually a divine invitation to something much greater. A thought given by God can transform not only your life, but also the lives of those around you, and even the course of history. Following God's voice in our thoughts is a journey that leads us to new places, new experiences, often challenging, but deeply transformative. It is a path that requires courage, faith, and the willingness to listen, even when the road ahead is unclear. Obeying divine direction takes us to places we never imagined, but we must have the courage to trust, to follow, and to know that God has a perfect plan, even in the small directions given in the silence of our thoughts. Now that you understand the impact that hearing God's voice can have, the most important question remains: are you ready to listen? The answer may be simple, but following that voice is a constant challenge. In the next topic, we will talk about how to prepare your heart and mind to hear, to truly recognize when God is speaking to you. What needs to happen for you to be ready to hear His voice with clarity? Let's find out. What we have learned today is something deep and transformative. God does not speak only in extraordinary moments or great revelations, but also in the silence of our hearts. He sends us thoughts, small signs that often go unnoticed, but when received with attention and openness, they can completely transform our lives. Think of Samuel, Elijah, Moses, Paul. All of these figures had something in common: a thought, an intuition, a direction that came from God. They were not waiting for great miracles to hear his voice, but they found God in an intimate, subtle, and silent way. And it was in that moment of silence, in that spark within their hearts, that their lives changed forever. But the question remains: are you willing to listen? Maybe, at this very moment, God is speaking to you. Maybe this message has touched something deep within you, something that is stirring in your heart, but you have yet to realize it. He may be guiding your steps, bringing clarity to something you have been searching for a long time. His voice is not limited to great miracles and visible manifestations. It is hidden in your thoughts, in the quietness of your spirit. And the true journey begins when you decide to stop, listen, and most importantly, follow. If you felt that this video touched something inside you, if something made sense or awakened a new understanding, I invite you to take the next step. Subscribe to the channel, because here we always bring content that can transform your perspective on life, spirituality, and your relationship with God. And if you know someone who also needs to hear this message, share this video with them. Leave a like, as this helps us continue bringing this kind of content that truly makes a difference. Remember, the journey of hearing God's voice does not end here. It begins now within you. Every thought, every moment of silence is an opportunity to listen and follow His direction. Stay tuned for more content that will help you hear, understand, and follow God's divine guidance in your thoughts. See you in the next video, and may the peace of God be with you.